Hello everyone and welcome to Daily Critique number 23, where I'm going to be discussing 5 images of Snowdonia by Ollie Pocock. In this episode we're going to discuss composition as usual, and then we're also going to discuss midtone contrast, and I'm going to go through a few quick re-edits of Ollie's images. So let's get started. So these are Ollie's images taken out and about in Snowdonia. We've got shots from the Glidderau, Carnedau and from Snowdon itself. So we'll go through them compositionally first, and then I'm going to discuss the issue with all 4 of these images, which is around mid-tone contrast and looking a little washed out and how you might deal with that. So let's have a look in Photoshop first. And we'll start with this one. I think it's fairly well composed. A nice imbalance, asymmetry between the foreground and the background. I think that wide angle perspective is quite effective, and you have actually got Snowdon in the background here. This is the Llewellyn Ridge and Snowdon Summit itself, and that's Crib Goch just there. So nice to have the iconic mountain in the frame. And the foreground maybe has a reasonable lead in here. I don't know if other people will pick up on that. I think as photographers we can be guilty of imagining leading lines when usually you need a path or river, something really strong to actually have that effect. But I do get that impression here. I think this mass of rock that's focused very much on the bottom right hand corner is possibly a little bit too close to that bottom right hand corner, and the contrast it makes with the snow means that it's a really strong focal point, and unfortunately this particular portion of the rock I don't find that interesting myself. It's a shame that some of this rime ice wasn't covering these faces here, but I guess the sun's maybe got to it and just melted it off a little. So I mean it's a nice shot. It's well arranged. I'd probably look for something slightly prettier for my foreground if it could be found, but it's been well executed and well processed, so a pretty nice shot there. So on to this second image, and I think Ollie's found a really good compromise with his backdrop here. The sun could do with being a bit further right, and this peak could also do with being a bit further right. These lines on the right are a bit linear, and it feels a bit empty on this side of the image compared to the left side of the image. But you have the lake down here at the bottom, and it's very necessary that the proximity to the edge of the frame is at least something like that. So I mean ideally I'd even have a tiny bit more space than that, but this would only make the issue you've got with the mountain and sun there worse. And equally you can't pan round to the left to improve that situation, because then the lake starts to clip the edge of the frame. So I think the compromise here is really good in terms of the background. Obviously one way to solve that might be to take the photo from a physically different location, 200 meters to the right, but I'm guessing that you'd be 100 meters into the air by the time you did that, so it wouldn't have been possible, I don't think, to get that perfect view looking down the lake towards the sun. So I think that backdrop compromise is the right one. But I think the foreground could perhaps be stronger to help with that relative imbalance, because you have rather a lot of empty space on this left-hand side that doesn't draw my interest so much. And I think if you could move these rocks up into that left-hand corner and perhaps create some dynamism with diagonal lines flowing through here, then it would make for a much stronger composition. And of course, that may or may not have been possible at all, but I'm talking very much in a perfect world, and even if it were just possible to find a slope that had some rocks in the right place, then maybe something like this, and then potentially you'd be able to see the bottom of the lake, and that would all finish off tidily. Then that would be handy. I mean, you can just see that very ugly hack of the kind of composition that I might be looking for in an ideal world. Okay, and then on to this third shot. I've actually been up this mountain before, Pen y Olwen, and there just aren't the foregrounds that I mean, I've never taken a photo up here, including a foreground, precisely because I couldn't find one that I really enjoyed. And I think that this shot probably is stronger for having the foreground, but there's no real structure there. I mean, these rocks are sort of interesting. I kind of like those flowing lines. They remind me a little bit of Torridonian sandstone, but yeah, nothing really beautiful about the foreground. And I think you need to be a little bit careful with this green grass here as well, because I've had a look at the raw file and that green is very natural. In fact, if anything, it's been slightly toned down here already, but it competes so much with the more subtle greens in the image that I would probably drag some more saturation out of there. Incidentally, this little corrie over here is where I had one of my worst group camps ever. We camped down low to get out of the wind that was raking over the tops of the mountains, and unfortunately the wind here was going from 0 to 50 miles an hour by midnight, so had to bail the group out in the middle of the night, which was not particularly pleasant, but we all got out safely. Yeah, so I mean, a nice image that lacking a bit of mid-tone contrast perhaps in the distance, and I'll go through that edit in a second. And you can also see there's the effect of polarizer on this central portion of the sky here, and I'd look to redress that tonal balance in the sky to just remove that sort of central area, or quite so much emphasis on that polarization. The polarizer's essential here really to cut through the haze so that you can see through to the mountain a little better, but that over polarization is an issue. And then on to this shot looking from the top of the miners path into the Snowdon Horseshoe. Amazing to see this at sunrise. I've been up here myself on a rather lovely winter's morning. I think this is pretty well composed. When I shot this myself, I actually looked for some foreground interest, and I think maybe that's a bit better than just this straight banana-like curve, which we've seen in some other wide-angle work from Scotland. That does happen if you shoot these ultra-wide-angle perspectives. Yeah, tonally it is a bit washed out and flat, and unfortunately the sun is just shut down too much by the haze that's on the horizon, so we don't really have that lovely warmth or contrast of the light that you'd like to see that would really bring this hoarfrost on the grass alive. So I think the conditions are a little bit of a letdown here, and certainly this empty portion of the sky becomes a bigger problem because you've got the mountains sticking out into the top of it, so you can't just put the top of the frame there because there's too much proximity to the tops of the mountains. So that is also a bit of a problem, that you just have this relatively flat shape at the top there. But otherwise nicely arranged and nicely balanced, and technically well executed, with the exception of the editing perhaps. And then finally this ultra wide perspective looking across into I think it's the Ogren Valley, isn't it? I always get these names confused, to be perfectly honest. So that's Igarn over there on the right, and Trivan here, and Gliddervow would be off to the left, and Gliddervac off to the right. But nice perspective this. Pretty dramatic light with the sun filtering through the clouds, but compositionally I'm not sure that it really works for me. I mean, the two focal points really are obviously the sun and Trivan here, and I sort of feel like the central portion of the image doesn't hold as much interest for me because those are such strong focal points. I mean, maybe the valley here and Pennyolwyn, where that previous image was taken, do work together and do that job, but that was my initial impression, at least when I looked at the image. So let's have a look at these quickly and do some comparisons with my edits. In fact, we'll go back to front, because Ollie did send me all of his raw files, and I've done a really nasty edit with this one, just quick and rough, but you can see if I compare the two, let's do that instead, that I've kept a lot more contrast in the image. There's a real lack of shadows in Ollie's edit, and it just looks rather washed out. There's nothing wrong with having shadows, and you don't need to open up shadows overly to see some detail. Shadows make light look light. So although my image is much darker, the sun might look a lot brighter in this image simply because it's presented next to darker tones. So shadow is a really important part of luminance, and I've actually just achieved this really by adding more contrast. So we'll just have a quick look at the edit. Yeah, so you can see that I've just darkened the highlights, boosted the shadows, and added some contrast. I mean, the raw file was in a pretty good position straight away, and Ollie shot this as an exposure bracketed panorama, so all that information is there. But it's very quick to tonally rebalance the shot, and maybe I'd add a bit of brightness in. And I just have a little dance with these 4 controls quite commonly when I'm working with these images the first time around, and just see what looks good. And maybe you'd look to recover a bit more highlight detail around the sun there, but yeah, much better that to retain some more of the contrast. Because as I said, Ollie's edit looks a little washed out. I also felt it was better to keep it wider and have glitter vac here on the right hand side. You can see there's a big bow on the horizon here, which would need to be corrected in Photoshop because the mountain should be more up here. But I think if you include that, it starts to frame the view a little better, and the sun and Trevan here aren't forced too far to the edges of the frame. So I actually prefer that wider perspective myself. And the foreground here doesn't look too distorted or distracting, actually. So that would be my my personal inclination, to keep it that little bit wider. And then similarly, I'm just going to show you the others and how I might edit those. So you can see I've got a lot more contrast and color in my edit, maybe a tiny bit too much. That's always the problem when you're comparing the two. But it looks about right on its own, maybe a little bit too much color up here. And you can see a bit of a halo creeping in because I just did a very quick edit with the highlights and shadows, as I often do. One more thing I might do here, I would just reduce the prominence of this path. So I basically, if I want to do something like that, I will create a new layer and then potentially use just the spot healing brush here actually. And then I'll paint over the path and it will just do its spot healing magic, and just do this very, very coarsely for the time being. Because I don't actually want to remove this path, I just want to make it less visually obvious. So I'm just effectively creating an area that's tonally similar around the path, and then I just dial back the opacity of that layer, so it just takes the life out of the contrast of the path there. So that would be one technique for reducing the visual distraction of a particular element. And yeah, I would get rid of these contrails myself because they're transient elements that, you know, wouldn't be there on any other day, and they just kind of ruin that sky for me, to be honest, particularly this prominent diagonal line running through here. So I'd do a little clone job there as well. And then if we quickly compare these two, so we're back to our image of Penny Olwen, and you can see my edit there on the right. Again, a hasty edit, but you can see I've just cut through a bit more of the haze and revealed a bit more color in the mountainside there in the distance. So really, that's mostly done with contrast, partly for the whole image, but also locally in that distant mountain area using a brush tool. And incidentally, on this editing, I do hope to put together a series of tutorials, some of which will be free, some of which will be as part of a paid course. I need to replace some of my income that I've lost through all my cancelled tours and so on. But this isn't really the place to get into all of that. And also you can see here that I've just tried to rebalance tonally the sky, and you can see some hue shifts which are not desirable. So one of the problems when you have heavy polarization locally in a sky like this is even if you do darken other areas of the sky, they will generally be of a different hue and saturation, and matching those areas does require a pretty keen eye and a bit of time. So that can be difficult to do well, but certainly possible. And there's various cheat ways you could get around that. I mean, you could just pick one of these blues and then paint that color across the sky, and then set that layer to a hue layer or a color layer and see how that looks. But yeah, it's a little bit tricky doing that right. But that's how I would edit that penultimate image. And then finally onto this shot of Snowdon, not as much difference here. But you can see that I have added a fair amount of contrast in this, in the whole shot actually, and I think that contrast range is more natural and a bit more impactful, but it does create more of an issue with halos, and I would have to spend some time removing halos with this my own shot, so that is the drawback, because you can see Ollie's edit is much more artifact free. So that was interesting to go through those. Some really nice shots there, Ollie. And handy to be able to talk about midground contrast, and I enjoyed talking about the composition of this image as well, because that's a really nice shot you've got there. So thank you very much, and I guess I will speak to you all tomorrow.